The staff's been having a lot of fun with my sermon title this week. This idea of inciting a riot. It reminded me of a Carmen song from the late 80s called Riot. I was hoping to get Judy to rap for us, but she said no. This is one of my favorite stories in Scripture. And I think in many ways it's very relatable to us today. It's an interesting time in our country. It kind of feels like everyone is on edge, fractioned and factioned and divided, and some days it feels like ready to explode. And that got me thinking about this episode in Scripture. It's not all that different. It tells us a story of a riot that broke out 2,000 years ago, and the reasons were different. They weren't rioting because they wanted freedom from a dictator. They weren't protesting because they didn't like the governor's new legislative agenda. They were rioting because there were Christians in town, and these Christians were being too Christian. Isn't that awful? Try to picture it for just a moment. Hundreds of people at the town square carrying signs and chanting and yelling because the good folks at First Baptist were being too Christian. I wonder what that would look like. But that's exactly what happened. It's a story about a group of believers that really got it. They took it to heart and they lived it. Ron, I'm not even going to try to use my phone today, so you're going to have to stay awake. This group of believers that lived their faith in such a way that their faith was transforming a city. And it resulted in a riot. Now, we like to talk about all the great things that our Christian witness can and should accomplish. But let's recognize that there are other forces that might not be so excited to see that happen. And in Ephesus, they experienced quite a backlash, a riot. But there's a tremendous lesson of living faith for us in this story. Paul had been in Ephesus about 3 years, and he's preparing to move on. And Ephesus is a large city for its day. It's large in population, if not in size. And one of the main reasons for the size of Ephesus is the temple of Artemis located there. It's the chief temple to the goddess, also known as Diana, and it's quite a sight to have seen. The temple itself was a little over 300 feet long and a little over 150 feet wide, making it just a little bit bigger than a football field. The structure was supported by marble pillars 50 feet high. Its primary purpose, of course, was worship of the goddess Artemis. But in addition, it was part museum, part bank, part tourist attraction. The Temple of Artemis and the economy that it generated dominated not just the town, but the whole region. Its religion, its culture, its economy. And if nothing else, the temple was good for business. When I was a boy, I collected pewter replicas on my trips. I had a replica of the Paul Revere in front of the North Church statue. I had a replica of Mount Rushmore that my grandparents got me when they went out there. On down the list. I know you've seen them, you might have them. You can find them everywhere you go. Our nation's capital is full of miniature replicas of the monuments. You can go to London and find replicas of Big Ben, Paris, the Eiffel Tower. Everywhere you go, someone is going to sell you a memento. A memento of your time there. And that's nothing new. They were doing the exact same thing in Ephesus 2,000 years ago. The tradesmen made a living selling replicas of the statue of Artemis for all the pilgrims and all the tourists. And that's where the trouble began. See, the Christians were cutting into the profits. The Christians were bad for business. What were they doing that was causing so much turmoil? Well, they weren't working through the government trying to get the right people elected and the right judges appointed so that they could ban the sale of idolatrous images. They weren't posting online about the horrible practice of pagan worship and how people were profiting off of it. They didn't organize any boycotts or hold any rallies to try to disrupt sales. They were simply being Christian. They went out and they witnessed to people and they preached the gospel of Christ. And so many people were being converted, it began to disrupt life. So many people were being converted that the people that made their money off of selling idols were beginning to feel the squeeze, and they didn't like that. Look with me at this passage in Acts 19, beginning of verse 24. A man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the artisans. These he gathered together with the workers of the same trade and said, "Men, you know that we get our wealth from this business, and you also see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost the whole of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and drawn away a considerable number of people by saying that gods made with hands are not gods. There's a danger, not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be scorned, and she will be deprived of her majesty that brought all Asia and the world to worship her." And with that, it began. The people took to the streets as an angry mob. The faith of the Christians in Ephesus had made such a difference in the city that it incited a riot. And we can learn so much about living a faith that people want us to share from looking at the different characters in this story. If you're like me, you learn as much about what not to do from people as what to do. And there's lots of what not to do in this story. The first is from Demetrius, our silversmith, the man who worked the crowd into a frenzy and got the ball rolling. If our faith is to make a difference in the world, we must always maintain pure motives. If our faith is to make a difference in the world, we must always maintain pure motives. In verse 27, Demetrius tells his fellow artisans, there's a danger that not only this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be scorned. He works the crowd into a riot by telling them these Christians have to be stopped. They have to be stopped for the sake of our goddess and her majesty. We can't allow this to continue, or Artemis's name will not be praised like it's supposed to be. Demetrius was a defender of the faith. He was acting as protector of his people's religion, wanting to make sure that nothing took away from their goddess's glory. I get the feeling that Demetrius was a smooth talker. He knows how to give a speech. He knows how to fire up a crowd. He knows all the right things to say and all the right buttons to push. He knows how to convince us that if we don't act now, something terrible is going to happen. Not just to us, but to our whole way of life. Except in the very beginning, when we dig a little deeper, we find Demetrius' true motive. He's concerned about his money. It says, he brought no little business. It's a great way of saying he was doing all right. From the sale of silver idols. And now all of a sudden that's in jeopardy. What was Demetrius' real motivation? The glory of Artemis or his own pocket? Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's what's in it for me. but it's hard to get others to be concerned about the size of your wallet. So Demetrius tells people that it's for the sake of Artemis. Something must be done. Friends, it's easy to be Demetrius. It's easy to develop a what's in it for me mentality. It's easy to be more concerned with what we can get out of our faith. And like Demetrius, it's easy to cover up our true motivation. But if we're to have a faith worth sharing, it starts with pure motives. If we want our faith to make a difference in the world, what motivates us is the most important starting point. The story doesn't end with Demetrius. He works the mob into a riot, and then the mob takes over. Look with me again at verse 28. When they heard this, they were enraged and shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The city was filled with the confusion and people rushing together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's traveling companions. Then skip down to verse 32. Meanwhile, some were shouting one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. I love verse 32. There was confusion in the crowd because most of them didn't know why they were there. I'm sure glad we never do anything like that anymore. Several years ago, there was a protest going on in Wisconsin over something, and I don't remember what. But my favorite video clip from the news, some reporter shoved a microphone in, he looked like he was a high schooler, he was probably a college kid's face, and said, "Oh, why are you out here today?" And this is a quote. "We're here trying to stop this dude from doing whatever it is he's trying to do." I love that. That was kind of the crowd once the mob mentality took over. We're here trying to stop this dude from doing whatever it is he's trying to do. It's usually the case when a riot breaks out, when mob mentality takes over, people get caught up in emotion of the moment. They don't even know why they're there in the first place. If our faith is to make a difference in the world, we cannot allow ourselves to follow the crowd. Now, I'm sure none of you have ever done something you regret because of pressure from the crowd. The crowd can be a powerful force. Sometimes the roar of the crowd can drown out everything else. To not follow the crowd means to be different. It means I'm not going to dress that way just because the crowd does. I'm not going to talk that way just because the crowd does. I'm not going to treat people that way just because the crowd does. I'm not going to behave that way just because the crowd does. To not follow the crowd is to stick out, and most of us don't like to stick out. We like to fit in. We like people to like us. Even when we do like to stick out, we like to stick out in the same ways that other people stick out. So often, if we're not careful, we'll go along to get along. But society is changed when faith motivates us to step away from the crowd. And those are the people we remember. I was talking with John earlier this week about a class I had in college. Really, when I first started feeling a call to ministry, it was really an introductory level class where we very briefly studied all the major Christian thinkers from Augustine to Martin Luther King Jr. And it was getting near the end of the semester, and we were in the 20th century, and most of us were bored. I was bored, everyone else was asleep. Because class after class, we'd start talking about some theologian from Europe. And the story was always the same. The 30s came, and Hitler rose to power, and people started feeling squeezed, and they fled to America, and they started teaching at Union Seminary. And it was amazing the way this pattern just kept repeating itself. And then we got to one guy, And the story started off the same way. This German theologian had a lot of really interesting stuff to say, was getting in trouble with the Nazis, fled to America, was teaching at Union Seminary. And I thought, oh, this sounds familiar. Here's another one. But then it took a radical detour. He went back. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He left a cushy job at an incredibly well-respected seminary in America to go be part of the underground church movement in his home. He was thrown into a concentration camp where he ran a seminary, and he was executed a week before it was liberated. Now, if I dig around in my brain for a while, I can probably start to name a few of those other guys we learned about. But one story sticks out 20 years later. Why? Because he risked it all to follow his faith away from the crowd. As the riot continues, we see more examples of how to keep our faith from making a difference in the world. Move down to verse 35. When the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Artemis and the statue that fell from heaven? Since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing." The politicians show up. The city clerk is there. And it looks like he's going to try to save the day, diffuse things, calm everyone down. But he isn't worried about protecting Christians. He isn't worried about the glory of Artemis. He definitely isn't worried about Demetrius's money. He's worried about his own skin. He was responsible for all communication between the city and Rome. And he was responsible for all public records and presenting all business to the city. And if things got out of hand, it would be his head that Caesar came looking for. He's trying to protect himself by keeping everything the way it's been. If we want to keep our faith from making a difference in the world, then we should stick to the status quo. The city clerk serves as a warning about making concern for the status quo part of our faith. The status quo says, let's keep things the same. Keep them the way they are, the way they've always been, the way we're used to them being, the way we're comfortable with. With the status quo, the point of conflict isn't whether a new idea is good or bad, but with the fact that the idea is new. If we want to make sure our faith never makes a difference, we need to just be content to keep things the way they are. If we want to effectively share our faith with those in our community, those that need to hear it, we can't be too concerned with the status quo. Jesus was never much interested in keeping things the way they were. He came to earth and he turned the status quo on its head by preaching a way of life that was radically different than what people were used to hearing. His call to us is to never be content with the way things are until his will is done on earth as it is in heaven. To never be content with the way things are until his will is done on earth as it is in heaven. Finally, this morning, there's two more characters I want you to consider in this story. They're Gaius and Aristarchus. Two men snatched up by the mob to feed their frenzy. Who were they? Apparently, they were traveling companions of Paul. Maybe Gaius was who Paul lived with while he wrote the letter to the Corinthians. but it's such a common name, there's not really any way to know. Aristarchus ended up following Paul all the way to prison in Rome. But that's really all we know about either of these men. We don't have any sermons they preached or letters they wrote. We don't know of any of their deeds for the church. No one names their children after these heroes of the faith. They were just two of Paul's companions, disciples of Jesus with pure motives, people who weren't afraid to step away from the crowd and weren't content with the status quo. Unknown men who, like so many others, lived their faith in such a way that they incited a riot. Would you pray with me?